A submarine survives by not being seen. On September 2, 1944, a few miles off the Japanese-held island of Chichijima, the USS Finback did the opposite. It came to the surface in broad daylight, close enough to enemy territory that island guns, aircraft, and small boats were all real dangers. It did not surface to attack. It surfaced for one man in a yellow life raft. The man was 20 years old. He was injured, sick from swallowed seawater, and trying to keep the wind from carrying him back toward the island. Minutes earlier, his torpedo bomber had been hit while attacking a Japanese radio installation. The engine caught fire. He bailed out over the ocean. The two men flying with him did not make it out. The pilot's name was George Bush. Bush had been flying a torpedo bomber against a Japanese radio installation on Chichijima when anti-aircraft fire hit the aircraft and set the engine alight. He managed to get out over the sea. His two crewmates did not. By the time he reached the raft, the aircraft was gone. He was alone, and the geography of the rescue was already working against him. The island was close enough to matter. The wind and water were carrying him in its direction, and Japanese boats were already coming out. Finback therefore was not arriving at a calm pickup point. It was entering a race. The submarine could stay hidden and preserve itself, or expose itself long enough to recover a man who, in purely immediate tactical terms, could not help the boat survive. The Navy's answer was to surface. The strange part of the story is not that an American sailor wanted to save him. The strange part is the weapon the Navy was willing to risk to do it. A surface submarine gives up the protection that makes it dangerous. It becomes visible. It becomes vulnerable. Yet Finback rose anyway, put men on deck, hauled Bush aboard, and disappeared beneath the Pacific with him alive. That moment exposes a deeper difference in the Pacific War. The United States and Imperial Japan were fighting across the same ocean, but they did not assign the same meaning to a defeated airman. One system increasingly treated a trained pilot in the water as a man and a military asset worth recovering. The other had built a martial culture in which capture and survival after defeat carried a heavy burden of shame. The difference was moral. It was also operational. In 1941, Japan's War Ministry issued the Shinjin-kun, the Field Service Code, across the armed forces. Its message on capture was severe. A serviceman was not to survive the disgrace of becoming a prisoner. The code did not create every Japanese military attitude by itself, and individual men did not all think or act identically, but it gave official force to a much older ideal that treated surrender as dishonor and death as preferable to captivity. For an aviator, that belief had brutal consequences. A pilot who lost his aircraft over open water did not merely face the physical danger of the sea. He faced a military culture that placed far less institutional value on returning a defeated man to service than the Americans eventually would. The source behind this account describes Japanese pilots who sometimes flew without parachutes or chose not to use them rather than risk capture. That claim should not be stretched into a rule for every Japanese airman. The larger pattern is enough. Japanese naval aviation entered the war with an elite corps of highly trained pilots, but it had a fragile system for replacing the experience that combat consumed. That mattered because early war Japanese naval aviators were formidable. The men who struck Pearl Harbor and fought through the first great carrier battles had been trained for years. Many had combat experience from China. Their skill was not something Japan could reproduce quickly. But the system treated that skill almost like ammunition. Once committed, it kept being spent. That narrow training base created a dangerous arithmetic. If a veteran pilot disappeared, the replacement was not another veteran waiting in reserve. Replacing the aircraft was one problem. Replacing judgment under fire was another. A pilot who had already survived interceptions, bad weather, carrier approaches, mechanical trouble, and enemy defenses carried knowledge that could not be stamped out on an assembly line. This is where personnel policy becomes part of strategy. A military can possess excellent machines and still weaken if the people who know how to use them disappear faster than the training system can rebuild their skill. Early success can even hide the problem. An elite force looks powerful right up until the experienced corps begins to thin, and then every later loss becomes harder to absorb because fewer veterans remain to teach the next group. Japan did not build an air-sea recovery network comparable in scale to the American Lifeguard system described here, nor did it preserve veteran experience through a rotation and training system on the American model. Pilots remained exposed to repeated combat until wounds, death, capture, or the destruction of their aircraft removed them. So the losses accumulated twice. Japan lost the man, and it lost everything the man had learned. At Midway, then through the grinding campaign around Guadalcanal and the Solomons, veteran crews were steadily consumed. The exact causes of Japan's declining air power were broader than rescue policy alone. Aircraft production, fuel, training time, maintenance, carrier losses, and the expanding American industrial advantage all mattered. But personnel preservation mattered too. By the summer of 1944, when Japanese carrier aircraft met American forces over the Marianas, the qualitative gap was obvious. American aviators shot down Japanese aircraft in such numbers that the battle became remembered on the American side as a turkey shoot. Many Japanese formations were now being flown by younger, less experienced men who had not received the depth of training enjoyed by the elite pilots of 1941 and 1942. The Pacific had not merely swallowed airplanes, it had swallowed experience. The American Navy was solving the same problem from the opposite direction. A trained combat aviator required time, fuel, instructors, aircraft, ships, and money. If that pilot was shot down but still alive in the water, the investment had not vanished. The pilot could fly again, he could teach, he could carry hard-earned combat knowledge into another mission. And beyond the accounting, there was a promise being made to the man himself. If recovery was possible, the Navy would try to bring him back. That promise became a system known as lifeguard duty. The recovery plan also changed what happened before anyone hit the water. A submarine could be assigned its lifeguard position before the strike began. The rescue problem was therefore anticipated, not improvised only after an aircraft vanished. Pilots flew over water knowing that ships and submarines had been placed with recovery in mind. Air crews could search from above. A survivor could be marked. A submarine could be directed toward the location. None of that removed the danger. A downed flyer could still drown, die from wounds, drift beyond reach, or be captured before help arrived. A submarine could be too far away or unable to surface safely. Lifeguard duty was not a guarantee. Its importance was that the institution had decided survival was worth planning for in advance. Before major carrier strikes and bombing missions, American submarines could be positioned along likely flight routes or near target islands. Their assignment was not only to hunt shipping. They could also wait for aviators who went down at sea. Aircraft overhead might spot a survivor and report his position. They might circle, drop supplies, or mark the location. If enemy boats were moving toward the downed flyer, American aircraft could intervene. Then the submarine had to make the decision that ran against its most basic instinct. It had to surface. A submarine hidden below the sea is difficult to kill. A submarine on the surface near a hostile shore is a target. Yet that risk was built into the recovery system because the man in the water was not treated as already lost. One of the most striking examples came during the submarine tanks operations near Truk in the spring of 1944. The account this story is based on credits tying, with rescuing 22 downed airmen in only a few days. Across the Pacific War, the same account gives a total of more than 500 American aviators recovered by U.S. submarines. The number matters, but not because every rescued pilot returned immediately to combat. It matters because it shows that rescue was not an isolated act of sentiment. It was organized behavior repeated across the theater. And then there was Chichijima. That island placed the two systems almost side by side. George Bush was fortunate because Finback reached him before the Japanese boats did. He was pulled aboard, treated, and kept with the submarine for roughly a month while it continued lifeguard duty. According to the source account, Bush even helped with the recovery of other downed flyers during that period. The rescued pilot became part of the rescue system. But other American airmen who went down around the same islands were not recovered in time. Some were captured by Japanese forces on Chichijima. What followed was established after the war in trials on Guam. Captured American flyers were interrogated and executed. The post-war cases also documented severe crimes committed against the bodies of some of the dead, leading to convictions and executions of Japanese officers involved. There is no need to sensationalize those crimes to understand the contrast. The contrast at Chichijima is especially severe because it removes distance from the argument. These were not two abstract doctrines separated by continents. The outcomes occurred around the same island, in the same war, among men who had all been flying into the same danger. One American reached Finback and returned to the protection of his own military. Others reached shore or were taken by Japanese forces and entered a completely different system of captivity. The post-war trials matter here because they turn the comparison from rhetoric into consequence. They do not prove that every Japanese serviceman behaved the same way. They do show what could happen when captured airmen were placed inside a command environment where surrender already carried deep contempt and where prisoner protections could be ignored with lethal results. In the same small region of ocean, One downed airman could be treated as someone worth exposing a submarine to save, while another captured airman could enter a system in which defeat and captivity stripped away the protections normally owed to a prisoner. That does not make every American humane or every Japanese serviceman cruel. It does show how institutions and military values shape what men are ordered, permitted, and expected to do. The effect reached beyond the individual rescue. A recovered veteran represented preserved experience. A pilot who returned could fly again or help train someone else. A man who believed a recovery system existed also entered combat with a different expectation from one who believed that going down at sea meant abandonment. How much that changed aggressiveness in any specific mission cannot be measured from this source, but the logic is clear enough. Organized rescue reduced one of the costs hanging over every overwater strike. It gave aviators a reason to believe that survival after being shot down was not shameful and not hopeless, and the submarines performing that work were not soft instruments. The same American submarine force that retrieved aviators also devastated Japanese merchant shipping. It attacked the maritime network carrying fuel, food, raw materials, and other supplies the Japanese war economy needed. That dual role is what makes the contrast so revealing. There was another compounding effect. The submarine force itself was attacking the shipping network Japan depended on for fuel and raw materials. So while one side was losing veteran aviators and struggling to rebuild training depth, the same American undersea campaign was also tightening the material shortages that made aircraft operations and pilot training harder. Rescue did not cause that crisis, but it belonged to the same larger advantage. The United States could use submarines both to deny resources to the enemy and, when circumstances allowed, to recover scarce people of its own. A submarine could spend one patrol stalking ships and another hour exposing itself to pull a single flyer out of the sea. The two missions were not opposites. They came from the same strategic habit: destroy what the enemy needs, preserve what your own force cannot easily replace. Japan's personnel problem was more complicated than one code and more complicated than rescue. By 1944, Japanese aviation was being squeezed by losses, fuel shortages, reduced training, industrial limits, and the expanding scale of American power. But the Senjinkun's contempt for capture fit badly with the demands of a long industrial war. A modern air force depends on accumulated skill. Experience has to survive long enough to be reused. The American Lifeguard system made that idea physical. A raft was not the end of a pilot's usefulness. Being shot down was not the same thing as becoming worthless. A defeated aviator could still be a veteran, an instructor, a witness, a future commander, or simply a young man whose country had decided that survival did not erase his honor. George Bush happened to become the most famous man ever pulled from that water. His later life makes the rescue easy to remember, but the system matters more than the famous name. Finback did not know what Bush would become. The sailors on deck did not need to know. They only needed to know that there was an American pilot alive in the Pacific, and that they had a chance to reach him. That is why the scene off Chichijima still carries so much weight. A submarine built to disappear chose, for a few exposed minutes, to be seen, because one trained man in the water was still worth bringing home.